but she's very good if you don't mind her talking so fast. So that's okay. So welcome. Glad you guys survived the weather. Apparently it's winter. Yes. Your backpack fell.
Yeah, shut it off.
Yeah, I fell on my ass the other night. Man, that was awful. Ouch. I've got a bloody elbow and the sore cheek. It's unfair. I don't have enough down there. That's the problem.
You gotta push yourself out.
And I was being careful, and my Saint Bernard kind of traipsed across a neighbor's driveway, and it's the kind of neighbor who, makes sure that his driveway is as slick as possible, by having it completely newly paved and tarred and everything. And so the glaze ice was just perfect. So when I followed my Saint Bernard across, I ended up, with my head lower than my feet. You know how that goes. Ouch.
Cartoon character.
Yeah. Ouch. Did my daughter help? No. She just kept going with the other, because we have two dogs. She was walking one dog, I'm walking the other one. Ouch. But good to say, here I am a couple days later, and you know what? I'm apparently still alive. So that's good. There'll come a day though when, boy, I'm not going to be able to survive something like that. Just walking down here from the parking lot where I park for free, even with my really good boots, boy, it was slippery.
I get little spikes.
I have those too, but I was wearing the big, heavy, boots that I bought in 1987, and they're still good. But they have the big red rubber plugs underneath, so they're as good as you could get, but they're not really for slick ice. Man, and the trouble is that stuff, it's nice and snowy, but under it is the trouble, that same stuff is there. Well, greetings. I'm glad some of you have made it. I hope you're all safe and don't live on Upper Abbott or whatever. That's where the police closed the road because of all the accidents, I guess.
There was a bus up there earlier this morning.
We always have trouble with school buses on those roads. It's just, I think that's because that's where they send all the new bus drivers. That's how they become old bus drivers, through an experience like that. But as I said last class, thanks to Kant, we're now really at the climax of the course, I think. And as Emmett reminded me in the beginning of the course, I pointed out the famous quote about all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato, but all of contemporary philosophy is a reaction to Hegel. And that leaves it open, what kind of reactions might there be, and so on. And basically, I'm going to argue that the following philosophers that we'll be doing, like John Stuart Mill, I guess I could have pulled up. So if we look at where we're going from here, we did Kant. So today we're doing Hegel. And next class we'll be looking at John Stuart Mill. And I'll argue. And by the way, Mill's main work on liberty was published in 1859, the same year that I'm having trouble with Charles Darwin. Thank you. Charles Darwin published his big work, 1859, same year, and that was The Origin of the Species. And they're both philosophically evolutionary, and so where does that come from? By the way, Darwin's grandfather believed in evolution, so it goes back, right? Well, how far back does it go? I'll argue it goes back to Hegel and his contemporaries who were actually doing this, right? And then notice we'll move on to Kierkegaard, and I have to warn everyone when we do Kierkegaard, because he's probably the most depressing philosopher we'll cover, for good reason, but nonetheless, beware. That's trigger warning, etc. On Kierkegaard, and I'll touch on Schopenhauer somewhere along the way, who's if he were as popular, he would be at least as dangerous, I think, to a lot of people, mentally, right? And then Marx we'll cover, and I'll do my best to present Marx in the best light. He doesn't really get very good press in the United States for lots of reasons, and that's because Marxist Leninism, of course, led to the Soviet Union and other communist countries, which aren't really very Marxian. We'll see why that is. And then Nietzsche is also a reaction to Hegel. How do you react to Hegel once you accept Hegelian philosophy? But the best bet, I think, is American pragmatism. And we usually don't think of American pragmatism as an heir to any particular philosophy, but of course it is. And all the big named philosophers that started pragmatism were Hegelians at one point. And so I would argue that our country is essentially the one place where Hegel's philosophy really blossomed and continued to grow. Whereas we'll see with Kierkegaard, it's kind of limited. With Marx, it's limited. With Mill, it's avoided. I mean, he's clearly Hegelian, but he's not really followed by his community of philosophers who begin to study language, and we'll see why that's really important. And we'll do some of that as we finish. Okay, so in a sense, we should get back to Kant and what Kant succeeded in doing. And officially, he answered Hume, because Hume set the stage by saying that you can't do metaphysics if everything we know, we can know, from only what we're experiencing at the moment. Memory doesn't help. None of that will prove anything. Certainly, in a practical sense, we accept all of that because you have to live, right? But at the same time, you can't accept any of that stuff as like mathematical proof, that any of this stuff is the case. And Kant does answer that by saying, well, but we definitely communicate. We definitely have interrelationships where we understand one another and we understand the world and so on. So how can we answer that? And it has to be that there's some structure to the way we perceive the world. Now the trouble with Kant, though, is that Kant doesn't explain how that is. He doesn't try to figure it out, as far as I can tell, right? He just says this structure has to be there because we have to have time. You can't imagine anything happening without time being, and that's, yes, we agree. We all experience time, even in just, dreams or ideas or anything. Even just sitting there being bored, you feel like time is passing. We also have space, for anything that has dimensions. Of course, you can't. Yeah, that's absolutely clear. Although what that entails, remember, he's still not guaranteeing that there's anything out there. Although Kant famously thought there has to be things in themselves, following Locke, right? That there has to be a world out there that's causing this relationship with the self, that's having these experiences, and so on. But you can't see them. Nor, by the way, for Kant, can we know the numinous. The numinous for him is God. God, we know God must exist as far as Kant's concerned, but we can't actually experience God face to face because God is out. The same problem, right? You can't get outside of your own experience. And by the way, I think I mentioned when we were talking about the ontological proof, the teleological proof, the cosmological proof, those proofs for God's existence were named that by Kant who analyze them, and he does critique them. Lots of folks critique them, but the most serious critique of the ontological argument that I think we discussed, maybe not, was that for him the weakness is the predicate isn't a real predicate. Existence isn't a predicate as far as Kant was concerned, and that's why that argument doesn't succeed. But I mean, I think I held up a magic marker and said, this magic marker exists, well, this eraser exists, this one doesn't. So it seems to me that existence is clearly a predicate. In any case, but the problem was Kant doesn't describe how we structure our experience so that we all can understand one another. And there's some really specific weaknesses associated with Kant and his point of view. Remember, he never left Königsberg, or the area of Königsberg. He did speak, I think, at least Latin. I don't know what other languages he might have spoken, but he seemed peculiarly not aware of all the other cultures that people were finding. Even John Locke and others were finding out all these cultures. David Hume especially was finding out all these cultures existed, and that people thought differently than Scots, and so on. Kant seems unaware of that and thinks that all rational people think the way I do, basically. And of course, that becomes obviously not the case. And yet there are some certain similarities that we all share as human beings. So in my quiz questions, or not my quiz questions, my tests, let's see if I still have that up. For test 3, notice we did cover Hume and his argument why metaphysics is not possible. And so this question, how does Kant's response to Hume start what we might call modern psychology? In my understanding of it, the modern psychology movements all were an attempt to figure this problem out. How do we structure our experience? And so biologically, we might have something like Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychology is the belief that that our experience, and a lot of this is actually clearly true. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to have a Rorschach test. You ever heard of those? Rorschach test is a series of 50 bilaterally symmetrical ink blots that were made. And what a psychologist will do is put those ink blots in front of you, and without any, actually today I think a computer does it, but if you, I was tested once in Hahnemann Hospital by a psychologist, because I was under the application process for getting into the seminary in the Episcopal Church, and that was a requirement. They wanted to make sure I was sane. And so they had me sit for a Rorschach test, and he laid out these meaningless, bilaterally symmetrical ink blots, that then you're supposed to tell him what you see. And it's such a silly game, because what you're really trying to do is convince the guy that you're sane by only seeing what you think sane people would say when they saw that particular shape. So easy one's butterfly, bat, my mother with an axe. No, you don't use that one. Anything, that would be absolutely horrible. I worried about Star Trek. I was a fan of Star Trek, and you could think of Spock, with the ears and everything. And I thought, his generation, he might think that that's crazy. So I shied away from that. I was just trying to convince him that I was sane, and it must have worked because I passed. But the thing is, it is clear that when we're experiencing stuff, that we do categorize things according to some computer algorithm, basically our eyes work that way. I think I mentioned Eric Kandel and his work on eyes and how the eyes are so complex, etc. So that's clearly a case, especially with music and things. We seem to put things into some kind of arrangement automatically, and that's universal, it seems. We might disagree with Noam Chomsky, if you're familiar with him.